Thank you for joining us today for the presentation on the cognitive interview. This is the second session of our 7 sessions academy on arbitration. We have made application to have these sessions approved for the CLE. So throughout the presentation, you will be receiving notifications to verify your attendance with the Supreme Court. This is also our membership drive. So I encourage you to tell your colleagues about this academy presentation. As a reminder, our regular monthly meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, January 18th at 11:30. The topic is speech and off-duty conduct. Please join us. Today, Professor Antone Aboud is our presenter. Antone is a professor of practice at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at Penn State. He is the school's director of online programs and the director of the Center for Workplace Performance, the school's management outreach platform. Antone received a BA degree in government from Cornell University and a Ph.D. in collective bargaining, labor law, and labor history from Cornell. He also served as a labor arbitrator for several years and as a chief labor negotiator for both unions and employers. For more than 20 decades, he was a full-time management consultant specializing in risk management training and related interventions. I attended this session at the national conference. The course provided me with a way to improve my own skill set. I know this presentation will be quite informative. So I will turn the session over to you, Antone.
Thank you very much, Mita. I appreciate it. I really appreciate being here, working with your local chapter. I'm involved with our virtual chapter, but obviously we owe everything to Lyra, to Emily and Bernadette and the whole crew that helped manage the entire spectrum of our activities. So thank you guys, and Mita, thank you for inviting me to be with the group. What I've done today is put together a program that's a little longer than what I did at the conference because we have more time. So what I'm going to do is try to give you a little background about how I look at the investigative process before we actually see how cognitive interviewing fits into that process. Now, I got to give you just a little bit of information here about my background. What you see as a screen says learning about interviews. I want you to know when I was in graduate school, when I got out of graduate school, this is what I knew about conducting interviews. It's on this screen right there. You see it? What do you see? You see nothing, right? Well, that's what I knew about conducting interviews. What was interesting is I received this doctorate in collective bargaining. We had courses on grievance handling, courses on arbitration, and so forth. And everybody said, you're going to have to conduct investigations and you're going to have to conduct interviews. And they could say, they give you all this great advice, but they never told you how to do it. I guess the idea was if you're smart enough to be here, you should know how to conduct an investigation. You should know how to conduct an interview. They just basically told us we should do it. And then they told us why we should do it and so on. The relationship between labor and management, what happens if you go to an arbitration, but never any instruction on how to conduct an investigation and particularly do an interview. 2 things happened after I left graduate school. This was in the late 70s. The first is I went to a grievance meeting. I was representing management. I was working for State University of New York Office of Faculty and Staff Relations. I was in New York City at a hospital that was part of the SUNY system. And there was a grievance involving a woman who allegedly did something. I forget what it was, doesn't matter. We went to the meeting. It wasn't really a hearing, but at the meeting, it was a step 3 grievance meeting. At the meeting, a particular witness to an event was asked questions by management about what she saw. And she told, I guess, in a couple sentences what she saw. And at the same meeting, management said to the union rep, you want to ask her some questions? He did. And he asked her questions in a way that generated a completely different version of what she saw. Now, in essence, he was cross-examining her, if you will, because he was trying to, represent his client, wanted to get her to say things that would help exonerate the client. But in doing so, basically got her to remember things that she never thought to speak about when management simply asked, what can you tell me about this incident? And I remember sitting there and feeling stupid. I remember saying, I get it. I went to graduate school and this guy knows more about interviewing than it never occurred to me that what he was doing was something that I should be doing. Then what happened is a second event, a conference that was held in 1981. I, at that point, had quit my job with SUNY. I technically was employed as a faculty member, but I also was doing some consulting. And one of the projects I got early on was a consulting project to do training for managers in human service organizations, developmental disabilities organizations, psychiatric centers in New York. And they were being trained to conduct investigations on abuse and neglect issues that were coming up. It was a very huge project. Over that next couple years, I probably visited 30 different mental health and developmental disabilities organizations around the state, in some cases for several weeks doing training. And there was a conference that kicked all this off. It was a conference that included a whole bunch of folks who were nationally known. I can't even remember the names anymore, forensic scientists and so on. But there were a couple state policemen who we started talking to at the conference. We're doing the training, we're developing the training materials. And we were just chatting about conducting interviews and so on. And one of the questions came up, traditionally these investigators would ask somebody, what did you see when this event occurred? And very commonly, one of the ways in which people who had good reason to think they were there would get out of having to say anything. They didn't want to get their colleagues in trouble and so on. They'd say, I didn't see that, I wasn't there. And one of the investigators, and then the investigators we were dealing with pretty much said, okay, thank you, write me a statement saying you weren't there, it was over with. Well, the state policeman said to us, he said, everybody had to be someplace. Where were you? And I guess that's a good question to ask. If what you're trying to do is talk about eventually the credibility of the information that you are collecting. If somebody says I wasn't there, just say, well, where were you? And get a version of what they can tell you and were willing to remember at that moment about where they actually were. And then another piece that's going to come up later on in this presentation. Somebody said to one of the investigators, state policeman, I'm never quite sure what my next question should be. And he said, if you're asking somebody what happened and they tell you and you want to learn more, something always had to happen next. Always. Think about it. That's what we're living with. I don't care about all those scientists and physicists and astronomers who say time and space is different from what we see here on Earth. The reality for any one of us, something had to happen next. So one of the things we incorporated is the question, what happened next? Again, that's going to become more obvious why it's important as we move forward. But those two events are what got me thinking much more systematically about what it means to conduct an interview, and in very frankly, what it means to do an investigation in something other than my own haphazard kind of way I would have done in graduate school. So that's kind of the backdrop here of how I became to at least think about this as an issue. So what I'm going to do is follow this agenda. I'm going to give you some background on how I frame the investigative process, some general concepts. I think it would be hard for virtually anyone here to argue with them in the sense that they're pretty standard, definitional, if you will. And in some cases, maybe they push the edge a bit, you'll see. And if you have questions about it, please As we go through this agenda, I want you all to feel that you can ask questions. You don't have to wait to the end. I've already asked Mita to, if she sees a hand come up, I can't see the whole screen at once. She's a hand come up just to let me know, and I'll be glad to call on you. Then we're going to get into the cognitive interview process. What does it mean? And how does it compare to the standard interview? There was a way in which things were done prior to the mid and late 80s, pretty done almost routinely. And the cognitive interview concept, I'm going to contrast with what then was a standard interview process. I'm also going to show you that you already know all about this. You just didn't know what to call it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to, I think, illustrate to you, and I think you'll all agree with me, you've been doing this your whole life. It just is that maybe you didn't see the relevance to the work that we do professionally. And then I'm going to talk about how we actually create what we're going to call incident interviews using this concept and using tools that, again, you have known about your whole life. By the way, it's so much easier to teach people what they already know. I mean, if you, anybody who's been an instructor, you're always looking for analogies. You're always looking for ways to connect what you're teaching to what people have been doing. They just had a different name for it. And that's what you're going to see occurring here today. Are there any questions about the agenda, about where this is going, folks? Anybody? Anybody? You see a hand there? Anybody? Okay. I'll tell you what, we will take a short break in the middle for about 10 minutes. So I don't want you to think you're stuck with me. I have like 40 slides. I go through them fairly quickly, but it's still, I don't know if you're in a place, you can see the number on the slide there. You just don't know how many, it's about 40. So if you want to just know where we're at, you'll know. The reality here is that we'll be done certainly within the time frame you're booked for. All right. General investigative process. There's a premise here. It's hard to know. Anytime I teach an investigation class, I start with this premise. It's hard to know. You can wake up in the morning and think you know 10,000 different things. It's hard to know any single thing for certain. If we were doing a 3-day class or a 2-day class that I teach routinely, sometimes on Zoom, sometimes in person, one of the things I do is illustrate this. Sometimes I illustrate it this way. I'll say to folks, you know, I'll start with some introductory material about myself. And then I might also, before class, say to Mita, as I'm talking during that introduction, I want you first to sit right up front of the class. And then I want you to walk out. And when I usually say, put my watch on the table. That'll be it's kind of a silly little thing. Mita will then get up, walk out, and I tell her she's to stay outside for 15 seconds and then come back in and sit down. And I'm just sitting there. And she does that right in front of everybody, comes back and sits down. And I've made this point, it's hard to know, it's important. That's the premise. And so at that moment, to illustrate this, I'll say to people, can you tell me if anyone, while I'm doing this little speech, anybody leave the room? And less than half of the class routinely saw anyone leave the room. Now, Mita walked right in front of me. They had this, I mean, I said they had to see, they didn't. Obviously, if they were paying attention, they would have seen her walk in front of me. So then maybe we have a little less than half of the class who actually saw her get up and leave. The next question is, for those who saw her come back, how long was she gone? You know something? Anywhere from 15 seconds to 15 minutes. Probably clusters more between 5 and 8 minutes. It's hard to know. And if you're doing an investigation, whether somebody was in the room or not in the room might be a critical piece of information that you need. Whether somebody was out of the room for 15 seconds or for 15 minutes might make a difference in terms of a conclusion of fact that would be relevant to that case. And for an arbitrator, if you're an arbitrator, and some of you are, you're sitting there, you're collecting this information from people who have done investigations. You'd like to have some reason to believe a finding of fact. And if people weren't careful in collecting that information, asking questions that would yield credible information, you're limited to what you can know because it is hard to know. So let's think about what an investigation is. An investigation is the systematic collection of facts to describe and explain what occurred. The systematic collection of facts to describe and explain what occurred. Systematic collection. Systems imply rules. There's a methodology, a procedure, not I have my own way, not we've been doing it this way for 25 years. Those are not justifications for a procedure or a methodology. In our school, in any of the schools at Illinois, where Emily and Bernadette work, any of the management programs will talk about evidence-based management. If you're in the sciences and medicine, it's evidence-based medicine. If you're in engineering, it's evidence-based engineering. In a sense, that's what we're dealing with here. If you go to a doctor's office, here's something you know, and the doctor says your blood pressure is high. And you say, well, how do you know? Just because I can see it in your eyes. What would you think? We have Don. I can see Don. He's sitting right here looking at me. Don Collins. Don, since you turned on your video, I'm going. What would you think if a doctor said, "I just looked at your eyes. I think your blood pressure is a little high." You think that's a? Will you be convinced your blood pressure is high? Don? I'm not sure. Don, can you hear me? I think you're not. I got it.
No, I cannot.
Okay. Well, you wouldn't be convinced then. You wouldn't be. Kelly's also looking. Kelly, you think the doctor's nuts? Maybe? Because, yeah, you would. Because what we know is the way to do this is the right way, and there's a way to do it the wrong way. By the way, you can buy these little oximeters. Have you seen these oximeters now? Everybody's buying because of the COVID thing. It tells you your oxygen levels. It also tells you your pulse, and you can also buy things. Obviously, you put on your finger that tell you your blood pressure. But if you go to the doctor's office, they still do it the old way. And but there are right ways and wrong ways, and that's what we mean here. It's not good enough to say I have my own way of doing this. Facts. A fact is a piece of information. That's all it is. No one collects the truth. We're collecting pieces of information we use to try to determine the truth of what occurred. And we then can go to the question of describe and explain. Remember, we're collecting facts for the purpose of describing and explaining what occurred. Here we're dealing with two really different perspectives. Number one, when we're trying to explain something. In other words, just describing something's not enough. You can have, and for those of you who are lawyers, I'm thinking this much I learned in my ex-wife's criminal law class. You can point a gun at somebody, pull the trigger, kill them. That doesn't mean you're guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, doesn't mean you're guilty of manslaughter. You may be guilty of nothing. It depends on your motive. If your motive was to kill somebody you planned to kill, you're probably guilty of first-degree murder. But if it was self-defense, an act of self-defense, you honestly thought that person was going to kill you, the very same behavior would be not considered a murder. So in a sense, we always have to explain. Motive is one of the things we have to be concerned about. Why did somebody do something? Interestingly, motive is difficult to see. Anybody ever seen motive? Anybody ever look around, see motive walking around the room, sitting on a desk? Motive is a thought process that we have to discern based on behaviors and information received about people. But we can't collect motive directly. We can't see it. We can't hear it. Circumstances are another issue. Somebody's walking down the hallway, slips, falls, and breaks a leg, hits a head, dies. Why was there water on the floor? Maybe that's what they slipped on. Why was there water? We want to know something about the why of that circumstance. has less to do with motive than the circumstances around the death in this, or the accident in this case. So explanation is as important as description. So it's not enough to say, they told me this occurred. I still have to know, if I'm an investigator, why it occurred. And I know that any arbitrator who's in a case, particularly a disciplinary case, is going to want to know the explanation also, not just what happened, but why it happened. Relevant facts equal evidence. By the way, there are bazillions of facts out there. Just look around the room you're in. I'm telling you right now, there are bazillions of facts in that room you're sitting in. But you know what? You can't collect them all, you can't see them all, and most of them are not relevant. Relevant facts in a case equal evidence. If I say relevant evidence, that's redundant. A relevant fact is evidence. Facts that have the potential to help describe and explain what occurred. That goes back to our first definition. Potential. The word implies that not all the collected facts are going to be important. Let's suppose there are 4 witnesses to an event. 4 witnesses. How many should you interview? I would say all 4. Does that mean every one of them saw the event clearly enough or paying enough attention? Every one will be as important as the other in helping to decide what occurred and why? No, it doesn't. It could be one person was paying no attention at all, was standing right next to an occurrence, paying no attention, never noticed a thing. So we don't have to decide in advance which of the 4 witnesses are going to have the best information. All we have to do is always interview all 4. So in a sense, the word potential here helps remind us of that. And then help is another part of this. There's no single piece of information that will decide a case, ever. Even in a criminal case of murder, somebody says, I did it. I committed murder. I shot that person. That confession is not enough to yield a conviction. You always have to have another piece of information connecting the person to that crime. Well, the point, I guess, here is that we don't want to rely on fewer rather than more pieces of information. The more, the better. And so that gets back to the interview issue, for example, just as an example. I always remember cases where there might be 8 or 10 people to interview. And somebody might go through that and go for the first 2 or 3 or 4. Say, oh, they were all telling me the same thing. I guess that must be true. I'm not going to collect. I'm not going to interview the rest. It's too much time. And it can take time. That's right. But on the other hand, the reality is that you might never know what person is going to yield the most important information. Every person will help if they're relevant, to have the potential to help. So you'd collect all of it. And that's going to get to another issue we'll talk about in a minute. Let me stop here. Any questions, anybody? You guys believe everything I'm saying? It's the jury's still out here, so to speak. Jenny, I think you're laughing at me, Jenny. I think you, okay, well, we'll see. All right, if you have questions, let me know, folks. There are 4 forms of evidence. By the way, I remember when I first started doing the training, I worked with a lawyer. He and I worked on this together. And as some of you may know him as a lawyer, he's a well-known arbitrator now, Jeffrey Selchik of Albany, New York. He's in a national academy. He and I started young people together doing this stuff. And Jeffrey was very careful to make sure we talked about the 4 forms of evidence. One is testimonial, documentary, physical, and demonstrative. Now, we're going to focus on the testimonial evidence, but in any case, you would collect testimonies, what people communicate about their memory of observations they make. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Documentary evidence is the way we preserve testimonial evidence. Physical evidence are things and the spatial relationship between and among things themselves. And demonstrative evidence is the way we preserve information, physical information. Those are the 4 forms of evidence. And by the way, it's important to understand them. If this were a larger course, we had more time, we'd take time to spend on each one of these, but it's important to understand because each category of evidence, each form has a different set of rules for collecting them. So the reality is you have to know what you're collecting to know what rules to apply, because remember, there's a system, an evidence-based system for this purpose. And so not paying attention to what you're collecting can sometimes contaminate the system that you use. Now, having said this, these rules don't just come from nowhere. I keep talking about rules. They don't just show up. I mean, they don't come, there's no revelation here. We're going to find a secret book of rules. It's all based on evidence, but let's think about the values they represent. Speed. The more quickly we do an investigation, the better. Why? Because just in terms of testimony, people remember more about today than tomorrow. People remember more about tomorrow than the next day. So you expose memory to time, there's less of it. Somebody throws water on the floor. What's going to happen to it? Eventually it's going to evaporate. If you're not there to see it, it's gone. People can come in and change the configuration of room. They can change the makeup of a room where something occurred. Time is the enemy of evidence, so speed is important. When we conduct the interviews is important. Now, speed doesn't mean we rush the interview, by the way. It only means we do interviews as quickly as, schedule them as quickly as we can. Thoroughness. Thoroughness goes to the heart of what slicing the bologna is all about. We're going to talk about slicing the bologna today, about cognitive interviewing. That's what it's at the heart of it, because the more facts we collect, the better. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. It's hard to disagree. More relevant facts, at least, are better than fewer relevant facts. In the same way that if you're flying an airplane through a storm and having to land in an airport, you'd probably want 100% of the relevant information to decide which runway to land on, rather than 50% of the relevant information. So the more we collect, the better. And then objectivity. Remaining objective is critical. It's an important value. We can't begin an investigation thinking we already know the answer. I've done a lot of investigation training with former policemen. And I hope I'm not insulting anyone here. And you may not be one of the category of policemen I'm talking about, former policemen. But a lot of them were involved in retiring and getting jobs in many of the human service organizations. I worked with about human service organizations, about 40 different states, doing training of this sort. And they were looking very often for jobs in their police retirement, doing investigations, and were very attractive to most of the managers in these organizations. We're policemen, they must know how to do investigation. I can't tell you the number of times in class people would say to me, I don't need to do this. I can tell that guy's lying. And it all had to do with how they interpreted body language, how the person might smile or not smile. And it was very difficult to disconnect them from what they thought they knew before the investigation was over. The very best investigators don't care about the outcome. They don't care. All they care about is collecting all of the relevant facts, whether direct or circumstantial, whether testimonial, documentary, physical, or demonstrative, and collecting them correctly. And again, let me tell you something that you already know. Would you want to go to a doctor who always decides somebody's sick before they do any kind of diagnosis? How comfortable would you feel in that environment? Or worse yet, always figure nobody's sick before they do the diagnosis. Everybody looks good. The reality here is that we as investigators don't care. Now, that I'm going to make a contrast here, because in court, we ask the jury to care. You know, when a judge says to a jury, there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Basically, what they're saying to the jury is, with respect to the guilt of somebody who's being accused, I want you to assume the person is innocent unless the state builds a case of sufficient magnitude to overcome the standard, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, the jury can be prejudiced, but the investigator should never be prejudiced. Are there any questions? Anybody at this point?
Antone, I have a question.
Sure, Mita.
How does confirmation bias relate to the value and objectivity?
You know, it's interesting, Mita, you should raise that. Anybody who's been living in this world the past 10 years, the issue of bias comes up in so many different ways, and it has so many different categories anymore, whether it's implicit bias, and some people for implicit bias will call it unintentional bias or intentional bias. Confirmation bias, by the way, is that kind of bias that causes us to pay attention to the facts that we think confirm what we already know and already believe. So if I start with a belief that you did it, Mita, that you're guilty, if I start with that belief and I start collecting facts, I'm going to pay attention to the facts and credit the facts that tend to confirm that you did it. And that's difficult to overcome because it's a human characteristic. We all this isn't something that just happened in the last 10 years. It's not just something that happens in rare circumstances in our lives. It happens throughout our lives. That's how human beings are wired. And to some extent, they're wired that way in order to get through life because it's too hard to make independent decisions about everything all the time. On the other hand, when it comes to an investigation, if you start with the thought that, you know, if you're a management investigator, let's suppose, or let's suppose you're a union negotiator who's representing somebody in an investigation. If you start with the notion that the person is either got to be innocent or got to be guilty, confirmation bias would tend to cause you not to collect and or see and or credit information that is different from what you believe. So it is a real harmful characteristic and it's something we have to try to overcome. We have to, if you're an investigator, you have to just say, I'm sticking with the rules. I can't care. And by the way, one of the other issues here, should you even be doing the investigation? We didn't even get to that. There are times we know that some people shouldn't do certain investigations because there's no way we can expect them to maintain the objectivity that would admit confirmation bias as a real problem. The obvious example is we don't expect my wife, at least on most days, to be objective about me. So we wouldn't assign my wife to do an investigation about my conduct because we would suppose that she, I'm hoping, would exonerate me. And it would, anything she saw that confirmed my innocence, she would be glad to collect, and anything else she missed. I don't know, does that help, Mita? Does that explain?
Yes, yes.
Anyone else have anything on issue of that sort or any other issue I've raised so far? Okay. Let's talk about the cognitive interview process. What is testimonial evidence? I said it quickly before. Let's go over it a little more quickly, a little more carefully. An investigator asks the witness to communicate. Okay, think about this. I'm asking a question. I'm requesting a communication. We can communicate with words, most commonly. Nonverbal communication. People can up and down their head do that. Communication could be writing something down, but they're going to communicate something. But what are they communicating? They're communicating a memory. A memory. And that's important. Nobody communicates from an observation. An observation is recorded in memory. If anybody's here a psychologist, they know more about the operation of the human brain, cognitive rules about perception and communication, the way in which the head deals with information than I do. But here's what I know, is that if I'm asking questions, I'm asking somebody to communicate about a memory of an observation that person made. And the observation might be seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling, smelling. By the way, you can be without seeing and still be a witness. You can be without hearing and still be a witness. You can neither see nor hear and still be a witness, as long as you have some sensory ability, have some memory, and communicate it in some way. So that's what testimony is. Now, there used to be, and this is when I was first became involved in all this, there used to be a standard way in which people were taught to conduct interviews. It went something like this, if they were taught at all. Come up with learn something about the case, get a report, talk to the reporter, and then make a list of questions you want to ask each of the witnesses. Make a list and go down and ask them the question. And then record their answer. So you walk into the interview with a predetermined set of questions and essentially ask people to answer them. There might be follow-up questions on occasion, but for the most part, you were to follow the script that you created before you actually entered the room. And that would be the interview. And here's where the issue came up, I mentioned earlier. My name's Antone Aboud. I'm here to talk to you about XYZ. My understanding, you were at the room at the time. What can you tell me about this? I wasn't there. Sorry, I can't help you. Okay, thank you, goodbye. And that would be the end of the interview. It might take me longer than that. I was there, but I didn't see anything. I saw Fred. Where was Fred? Over there. What else happened? That's all I remember. Thank you. And you take your notes, and that would be your statement. That would be a standard way. And then I may be giving that a little bit of abbreviation, but that's the standard way in which they were done. And I put here, you're going to get this slide deck. I put here the citation from where that was discussed, where I took it from, but it's something I lived with and knew about. Cognitive interviews are different. This is taken just from a very popular website, Simply Psychology. The cognitive interview is a questioning technique to enhance retrieval of information from the eyewitnesses and victims' memory. There are a number of ways that these memories can be accessed. The cognitive interview exploits this by using multiple retrieval strategies. Really complicated. We're going to simplify this in a minute. But in essence, the witness isn't so passive as just listening to a question and giving an answer. Here, we're trying to help the witness remember. The whole idea is we want them to remember more completely and more accurately than they would if they just responded to a set of questions without any rhyme or reason to how those questions were being organized. Of course, the real problem here is avoiding contaminating the memories. We've got to do this in a way that doesn't create memory. We want to help them remember, not create memory for them. Generally speaking, anybody who writes about this, and by the way, the original, and I forget, Gettleman, I think is his last name, and there's going to be a reference page at the end. You can see if anybody wants to get into this more fully, you can. He originally did the research on this, maybe it was 1985. The original research was done on this. But as time went on, people who applied it to the interview process developed 4 prompts that are routinely used for this. One of them is asking the witness to report everything. Don't just report to me what you think's important. Whatever you remember, report. It's okay. By the way, you say, oh, it'll take a long time. Yeah, it may take a little longer, no question, but report it. Sometimes they'll change the order of questioning, the sequence of the question. So for example, FBI investigators, sometimes when they're really getting down and dirty with somebody, we're not talking about cross-examination here, by the way, they may ask people to go through a sequence of questions from beginning to end or from end to beginning. because they think that sometimes this particular prompt will generate memories that somebody might not otherwise have thought to recall. Sometimes they'll ask you to change perspective. This is another prompt. To say to somebody, you know, what I'd like you to do is think of yourself as Joe in the room. What might Joe have seen from where he was? To kind of force the person to think through spatial relationships and whether or not they would see something might emerge that they otherwise had forgotten about. And then sometimes they ask people to think of the context. Think about how you were feeling that day. What was the day like? If you came to our house this morning, by the way, my wife and I were talking about how dreary everything looked. I ended up turning on 5 lights in the house just so we didn't think it was the middle of the night. It was 11 o'clock. Well, it wasn't, just before 11 because I went up for a cup of coffee. So, I mean, that's another way to get people to start accessing parts of their memory they might not otherwise. These are just ways in which professionals who do this use the evidence that Gettleman had generated to apply to the interview process. What I'd like to do, and then we're going to take a break here in a few minutes, what I'd like to do is share with you. I said it's always easier to learn something you already know. I'm going to tell you, you already know how to slice the bologna. Anybody ever lose their car keys? I bet no. Kelly, all right, Kelly, you said you did. Kelly, will you unmute? Never shake your head yes or good. And then, all right, Kelly, here's the deal. You lose your car keys. If I said to you, just think about this. Here's the standard interview process. I said to you, where are your car keys? And you lost them, your response would probably be what?
I don't know, I lost them.
You don't know, they're gone. Okay, that's a standard interview technique. I want you to think for a minute how everybody finds their car keys. Kelly, that's before full disclosure. Have I paid you anything to talk here? Have I ever met you before? No, I mean, so there's no connection. We're not related. You're not related. You're not my ex-wife? No. Okay, all right. So now, how would you find your car keys if you couldn't find your car keys?
I think about when I saw them last and I start backtracking.
Okay, so you'd say to yourself, here's how Kelly would find the car keys. She'd say, that's right. I came home from the grocery store, had to have them. Yeah, that was okay. So I get out of the car, that's it. I got the groceries. And what happened next? Remember that term I said, what happened next earlier this time? What happened next? I went into the house. That's right. And what happened next? I put the groceries on the counter. And what happened next? That's it. I went upstairs to my room. I wanted to change my clothes. And what happened? And you know what? You remember, you left them on your in your purse. The work purse, purse you took to work, you put in your closet. That's, and all of a sudden, I remember. You basically what you did was you engaged in a cognitive interview. You helped yourself remember something that you said you didn't know. I've got to believe everybody in this room has had that experience. Maybe one of you hasn't, but unless you've never driven a car. But the point, I guess, is finding one's car keys illustrates exactly what we're talking about. Think about what's happened. There's a system. The system's pretty simple. Go back to a point where you can't remember having, you do remember having, and work your way forward, asking the question, what happened next? What happened next? What happened next? What happened next? And the system doesn't require you to know anything but that you couldn't remember them at point A. That's all it requires. It doesn't require you to know anything else. So you don't have to judge in advance where they are. You don't have to guess. And then there is a rule. Always ask what happened next. Think about it. What happened? You're applying a very systematic approach to finding the car keys. You remember more than the answer, I don't know where they are. Or let me give you another example. I grew up in Aboud's Market, the north side of Watertown, New York. That's where I'm going this weekend. I'm meeting my brother and his wife. My wife and I it's our anniversary and my wife's birthday on Sunday. I get to have one day, I only have to one day a year. So it's really convenient. So we're going up this weekend, and grew up in Watertown. On the north side of Watertown was Aboud's Market. David and I grew up in that market, and we worked in it. It was the days of the 1950s and 60s when these little corner grocery stores had meat and vegetables, and we carved up meat and so on. And we had a slicing machine to slice bologna. Has anybody here ever sliced a bologna? Anybody? Raise your hand. If anybody in this audience has sliced a bologna, raise your hand. I'm going to go to the next screen just to see if anybody's got their hand up. Not a single person has their hand up. Well, I guess it's somewhat of an old-fashioned thing, and I'm not even sure it happens very often in the supermarkets, but we used to slice bologna. And oh, we got somebody, Bruce. Bruce, can you come on board here with us a second? Bruce, would you be willing to unmute and to show us yourself? Can you turn your video on, Bruce, just to, if you don't, there we go, Bruce. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing okay for a guy. All right, Bruce.
Oh,
Here's what
my
I want you to
lighting.
do. I want you to
fix my
tell me
lighting.
tell me how to slice a bologna, Bruce.
Well, you want to take a sharp serrated knife and slice evenly
Evenly, okay.
with straight, even strokes back and forth.
All right. Are you going to take a slice from one end and then go to the other end and take a slice and then go to the middle and take a slice?
No, I will start at one end and complete all the way through to the next end.
Thank you very much, Bruce. You're a hell of a good slicer. Okay. Next time we see a deli needs a bologna slicer, I'm recommending you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly, we used to have a slicing machine. I have the tip of my finger is missing because I wasn't careful enough one day. But in any case, you always start at the beginning right here and you work your way slice by slice by slice by slice through the end. But now the question is, what is a slice? What is this? By the way, Bruce can tell us if he came back. I'll just talk for Bruce. We don't chunk bologna. We might chunk cheese or chunk, what is that? There's a liverwurst. I remember in the store, Bruce, and we had liverwurst. It's chunk liverwurst. Chunking the bologna would sound something like this. What happened last year? People can remember in smaller units of time than last year. Okay. On the other hand, we don't shave bologna. We shave boiled ham. We shave turkey. Isn't that right, Bruce?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. I tell you, you're just on board with me, Bruce. I owe you something. Between you and Kelly and Don, I owe something. In any case, here's the deal. Shaving the bologna would sound like this. Okay, Bruce, as you entered the room and your right foot in the first step was raised off the floor at least 2 inches, but not more than 4 inches.
Okay.
What did you see at that point? Now, don't answer that, Bruce, because I got another question. Now, as your foot raised to the apex of your step, that first step as you entered the room, at that point, nobody remembers in units of time of that sort. We remember in slices of time. And we're going to take a break and come back and talk about what that means and how we work that into a process we're going to call slicing the bologna. It's going to be our version of cognitive interviewing. And I will tell you, I've taught this for 40 years. And one of the things that people remember about the classes, they may not remember anything else. They certainly don't remember my jokes, but they remember slicing the bologna. And we'll come back and talk about it. So it's take 10 minutes, I guess, Nita, is that good? I think.
Fine, that means we'll turn back, come back at 12:30.
12:30. Okay, guys, see you then.
Antone, I had a question about sharing your slides. I know we talked about that. You said that you would, permit them to have the slides. I told them at the end of the presentation, though.
Yeah, I'll send the slides to you at the end. And you
Okay.
can distribute them any way you need to. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. All right, I'm just going to unshare the screen a second and make an edit.
Professor. This is Don Collins. I wasn't being rude. I had my sound turned off. I didn't
No,
know.
Don, I could tell that, Don. You know, Don, what I couldn't tell at first was whether you actually could hear me, which is why I asked you a couple times, because I'm sorry if I didn't think you were being rude at all. It's usually something just exactly like you said.
Okay.
So don't worry about it. No, please.
And the other part is my plaques in the back of the room. Several of them have the title Penn State University on them. So
Really, what school did you attend?
it was Institute of Public Administration.
Okay,
Graduate degree, and you know, I was great experience.
well, I guess then if I yelled at you, "We are," you know how to respond.
I do.
Okay.
Penn State, of course.
You know, it's interesting. Listen, I'm sure that, Don, I don't know, we probably shouldn't talk about this to the chapter of Central Ohio.
We can.
But in any case, it's fast. I live here in Albany, and anywhere you go, Penn State, like Ohio State, like Texas, like there are just so many graduates. It's such a huge university. You see people all over the country.
Oh yeah.
Anytime I see somebody, and I see all the time people in a Penn State sweater, and coming out of the supermarket a few weeks ago, the guy comes out big. I just yelled out, "We are," and the guy never dropped a stitch. Penn State. So people people never forget. I never forget.
It happens all the time in Central Ohio. So.
I actually have two nephews who played for Joe Paul.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my youngest nephew was there the year he passed away.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you mean Joe Paterno passed away?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I thought, my goodness.
Oh, no. Nate was there when Joe's last year.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in New York, and but I lived in Altoona for a while, Pennsylvania, back in the early 80s. And I've always loved Penn State football. I mean, I like college football, and I think the rivalries are great. And I've gotten to the point I care less about who wins and more just about the fun of it all.
Oh yeah, right.
But Penn State, there was a period of time in the 80s and early 90s when Penn State just used to win these games in very strange ways. And I remember my father, when my parents lived down in Altoona, I'd be up in Albany, and there'd be a Saturday afternoon game. And Penn State would be down to the last 2 minutes, and they're in a final drive, and they've got to either score a touchdown or kick a field goal to win. So I called up my dad, and we did this probably a dozen times over the years. And on the phone, we would have the TVs on in our living rooms, and we talk on the phone and watch the game together. It was just something we did.
Oh, geez.
You know, it never would have done that with any other team, but
That's hardcore. It's a little more hardcore than I am. So.
Well, it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Right. Very good.
Yeah, my sister said that they live in Southern Ohio, and I always wanted the boys to go to Ohio State.
Is that a question you have? Bruce?
No, I forgot to take it down. My fault.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Thank you. All right, guys. What I want to do is just get into some of the details. I made a point earlier that we're talking about incident witnesses, and let me explain what I mean. There are all kinds of witnesses you may interview, or different types of interviews even. I keep talking about an incident interview, and I'll explain that in a minute. There are also background interviews, exploratory interviews, follow-up interviews. There are such things as interrogations. We're not talking about in this class. It's not relevant to an investigation. It's relevant to prosecution. But the point, I guess, here is that we're slicing the bologna during incident interviews. If you're doing a background interview, for example, with a doctor or nurse about an injury, guaranteed you're going to make a list of questions. You're going to go and try to get answers to each of those questions. Has less to do with helping remember anything than helping explain things. An incident interview is an interview of somebody who is at or about the scene of an incident. So for example, this is a little way of displaying who we're looking for. This is the intersection of time and space. Every incident as an intersection of time and space. Something happened someplace at a certain time. And so it didn't happen at 6 o'clock. It didn't happen at 7 o'clock. It happened at 8, not 9, not 10. It didn't happen in the lobby, didn't happen in the hallway, happened in the stairwell, not the basement, not the storeroom. We're concerned about what happened at 8 a.m. in the stairwell. Now, I'm just going to tell you the case I took this from, I could have made it up, had to do with somebody who actually fell down the stairwell, injured, ended up on receiving, what do you receive when you get injured at work? Your workman's comp. I knew that. I guess it's a question of remembering. In any case, you're going to see I drew a little circle. We're interested in people who are within that circle. Somebody who might have been a little bit away from the stairwell, maybe just coming into the stairwell, just leaving the stairwell. Somebody who might have been there at 8:05, maybe at 7:55. But if you can put somebody in that circle, that's an incident witness. And that's somebody with whom we're going to try to find the car keys, so to speak. That is, they're an incident witness. Is that clear to everyone? Everybody comfortable with that? Okay, now we're going to conduct an incident interview. Let's look at the beginning is going to sound like the beginning of interview. Introduction. What we're going to do is introduce ourselves. And by the way, in some cases, you know the people you're going to interview, or they know of you, particularly if you're in HR. People may know you as an HR, or if you're in a union rep and you're interviewing somebody, they know you as a shop steward, but you're doing an investigation today. Part of the introduction isn't just to say, hello, nice to see you again. It's to identify why you're there, which gets us to the purpose of the interview also. So nothing mysterious here. And my name is Antone Aboud. I work in HR. Usually I handle compensation issues. Today I've been asked to look into an incident involving an accident in a stairwell. My understanding is you were there, an injury. I probably would have said an injury in the stairwell. My understanding is you were in the area at the time. And then I would ask them the first and most important question. What can you tell me about this incident? And I haven't said anything so far that seems inconsistent with even the standard procedure I talked about earlier. But now here's where we start being careful. You're going to have to use a transition statement to get to the next part of the interview. Because remember, how the person responds to this may involve two generally different approaches on the witness's part. The witnesses might say, I saw what happened. In other words, they're acknowledging they're a witness, that they have something to add to your knowledge base. Basically, they're giving themselves up as witnesses. Or the person may say, I didn't see what happened. And very frankly, maybe they didn't. We don't know. I didn't see what happened. But what we know is this: we're going to have to continue this interview because we're going to slice the bologna with both of these people. The person who says, I saw what happened, probably is going to give you some information. I can almost guarantee you it's not going to be thorough. Not because they're not trying to be helpful, but because they don't know what you need to know. In fact, you don't even know what you need to know at this point. The other person, and so you got to give them a reason why you're going to continue talking, even though they've already, in their minds, already answered the question. In the second case, I didn't see what happened. You particularly have to give them reasons why you're continuing. If someone says, I don't know what's going on, you're going to have an explanation of why you're going to continue to take their time. And so we have transition statements. Witness says, I saw what happened. Your response, you've given me a lot of information. I need to go back and ask more detailed questions about what you remember. And I might even add something like, this could be a bit tedious, but if you need a break, just let me know. If you need to know what I'm doing at any point, just ask me. It's just so they understand it's not one or two questions. It may be a while. Or the person says, I know nothing. Your response, sometimes people who are in the vicinity of an incident may have seen or heard something that could be helpful. I need to ask you questions about what you do remember. You might even add there, I don't even know if it'll be helpful yet. I don't know, but I just need to ask you a question. Again, I might say, could be a bit tedious. If you have any questions as we go through, just ask. And so I'm going to show you, I'm going to have to unshare the screen. I'm going to show you how this might work. I'm going to share a new screen. This will only take, I think, a minute to listen to, but it's pretty much what we'd expect as the beginning of this. This is Everhart. My name is Antone Aboud. I work with Amazon. I've been asked today, I work in HR usually, but today I've been asked to look into some kind of incident that may have occurred around your home this morning. One of our drivers delivered a package, and we have a report that there was some kind of altercation. I'm not sure exactly what happened between him and somebody in your neighborhood.
Wow.
I don't know what, okay. Oh. Well, I have no idea what just happened. What I then would have gone on to say is, what can you tell me about this incident? And she says, I don't know anything about it. And I say, sometimes people in the vicinity of an incident may have seen or heard things that even we at this point aren't aware are important. I need to ask you some questions about what you did see and what you did hear. That would have been the rest of this example. I'm sorry that happened. I'm not sure why. All right, let me go back to the PowerPoint. So now we're going to talk about what is a slice of time. What is a slice of time? It's easy enough to talk about it in terms of a bologna. It's harder to understand in terms of slicing the bologna as a way of conducting an interview, a cognitive interview. So that's just, we go back to the slice, you saw the slice. Let's think of this. Here is a room or two rooms. It's a location. Let's suppose something happened in room B, but you're dealing with a witness who says to you, you know, I was at point 1 here in room 1 and room A, and I ended up walking over to room B to point 2. Okay, so you have, maybe you even made a diagram of this, and they're trying to explain to you their locations. And let's suppose the incident occurred in room B. Now, we're going to ask, what can you tell me about this? And the person says, well, I was initially in room A at point 1. So I might ask the question of what were you doing there? Who were you with? And so on. Now, what do you think the next slide, after I've established what was going on at point 1, what do you think the next slice of time would be? What would determine it? Anybody have any idea? I'll tell you what, I'll just click on this. Think about this. So I say to somebody, okay, you were at point 1. Remember the question that the second question, the investigator told us at that conference in 1981, what happened next? I would say to them, what happened next? Was I walked towards the doorway. Why would walking toward the doorway from point 1 be another slice of time? Think about what's happening at point 1. Let's suppose the person says, I was at point 1 reading a book. What are you paying attention to when you're reading a book? You're paying attention to the pages. You're trying to understand what's on the pages. Lots of things can be happening around you, which are not on those pages that you never notice. But when you stand up and start walking towards a doorway, basically you orient yourself to a whole bunch of new pieces of information that you didn't notice before. And so I would say, okay, as you started walking toward the doorway. What did you see? Who'd you see? What did you hear? So what's the next slice of time? Well, anytime you enter a new location, because they've shown us in the diagram, they're going into the hallway. Anytime you enter a new location, we tend to look around. It's another set of stimuli, some more pieces of information we didn't notice before. So you're entering that new location. What did you see? Who did you see? What did you hear? As you entered room B, what did you see? Who did you see? That's a new slice of time, new location. As you walked over to point 2, what did you see? Who did you see? What did you hear? All slices of time, because each one represents a different set of stimuli. Now you're at point 2. And let's suppose you say, well, what happened at point? I was sitting there, I was talking to Fred and yada, yada, yada. This is interesting, by the way. Notice these 2 little diamonds I put in here. These are interesting little nuggets, if you will. This one comes before this one, both in terms of space and time. They're coincident, because if you're moving along this line, time is moving coincident with space. That helps you stay organized. You visually have something that represent the various slices of time, the way in which you're going to sequence. But now you're at point 2. The only thing that's moving is time. Space is standing still. What is the next question? It's what happened next. Something had to happen next. And you know what's interesting about this is it may have happened 2 seconds later or 15 minutes later, but and the person may not even know how much time elapsed, but it's what caught their attention next. Joe came in the room laughing. Okay, that's the next slice of time as Joe entered the room laughing. Can everybody see, anybody have any questions about this? Can you understand the idea here? We're moving, it's like looking for your car keys. What happened next? What happened next? In this case, we can represent it visually. Now, having said all that, we need to still put this in some order. And so we're going to start organizing the interview in the same way, but with a little more detail than you would if you're looking for your car keys. We have slice 1, slice 2. I guess if we're going to stay organized, by the way, we don't look for our car keys or what happened when I was in the car, what happened when I was in the bedroom, what happened when I was in the kitchen. That would be out of order. We're going from one slice to the next slice to the next slice to the next slice, figuring that what we learned in the first slice might help us remember something in the second slice and so forth. So we're going to go from slice 1 to slice 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And what we're going to do up here is start with seeing. We have 5 senses. When we are slicing the bologna, however, we're going to ask about only 2 of them, seeing and hearing. We're not going to ask routinely now. We may ask because it comes up. We're not going to ask routinely about smelling, tasting, or feeling. That they're going to be exceptional areas that we'd explore because of circumstances. The sense that we learn the most from is seeing. There are more stimuli around us seeing than any other of our senses. So we always start with seeing, because what we learn from seeing might help us remember something that we've heard. That's how we start. And we also have a reason to always start with seeing. Because if we start with seeing and then go to hearing, and we're done with hearing in slice 1, that means we know that the next set of questions has to do with seeing in slice 2. We can stay organized. People say to me, how can I remember all this? How can I know where I am? It's because you're creating a system that you already know how to use because you found your car keys, except you're going to know where you are in this matrix. So if it's seeing in slice 1, you're going to hearing in slice 2. If you're hearing in slice, it's your hearing in slice 1. If you're hearing in slice 1, you're going to seeing in slice 2, and so forth. So we always start with seeing, and then we go to hearing. Then let's think about slice 1, seeing. We're going to start with the question, what did you see? What is broader than who? What might include events, objects, it might include people, but it's broader than just who did you see? So somebody might say, I entered a hallway. What did you see? If the person says nothing, or at the point they say nothing, who did you see? Now let's, and by the way, we're always going to ask about who if they say nothing to what. By the way, you can walk down a hallway and not remember anything. We've done it all. We're thinking about something, we're paying little, we only know we walked down the hallway. But some people may distinguish between what as an event or object and who as a person. So if we ask, what did you see? Nothing, I would go back and say, well, who might you have seen at that point? If they say nobody, where are we going next? We finished, what did you see? Who did you see? Where are we going next, folks? We're going to hearing. What did you hear? Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that hearing, probably we don't distinguish between a sound that comes from a person or a sound that comes from a tree falling in the forest. What did you hear? I heard a voice. What did you hear? I heard a tree falling in the forest. I mean, we're just likely to, would you hear nothing? Who did you hear? Would seem just a little pedantic, I think. And we don't want to bore somebody. I mean, it's boring enough to do this if you're the witness, but we don't want to bore them. So what did you hear? The person may say nothing. Now, remember, what did you see? Nothing. Who did you see? No one. What did you hear? One of the points I'm going to make to you is the last answer will always define the next question. So who did you see? Nobody. We'll talk about follow-ups if they did see somebody, but who did you see? Nobody. That means we're done with seeing, we're going to go to hearing. What did you see? Nothing. That means we're done, we're going to go to the next question. By the way, let's suppose we finish seeing and hearing. What's the next question? What happened? Well, we keep coming back to what happened next. That investigator in 1981 gave me a question that I've been using my whole life. What happened next? I entered room B. That's our second slice. And so we just repeat this. Everyone see what's going on here? Basically, we're going to use these questions. There are 3 questions within the framework. What did you see? Who did you see? What did you hear? That we're going to use to help identify the information they may remember. And we're working through systematically because we want them to remember more than they would remember if we just ask them, what do you remember about this event? We're trying to generate more without telling them what to say. So this is basically the framework we're working with. Now, you know what? I'm gonna try, let me go back and see the next, I have another video here. Let's see if this one works. Give me a second. I will go back to that. It's gonna take me a second to pull it up. I hope this one works. I apologize if it doesn't, but we'll see how it goes. Share the screen. Let me share it one more time. I want to make sure I got to share. Yeah, okay. Ms. Everhart, we know the package was delivered at 8:58. That's the timestamp when it was delivered. So I guess the question is, what were you doing maybe a little before that at 8:45, for example?
Well, I've been working from home, so I was in my home office. I start at 8 a.m. I was in my home office on my computer.
Okay, and who were you with at that point?
I was with no one. I was by myself.
Okay. Other than the fact you could see your computer and your work, what could you see? What did you notice at that point?
I noticed nothing unusual.
Okay, and who did you notice?
No one.
Okay, and what could you hear at that point? What did you hear?
I don't recall hearing anything out of the ordinary.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you could hear the clicking of the keyboard. for
Sure.
example.
Yeah.
All right. What happened next?
At some point I did go up and water the plants on my deck.
Okay, so let's go from you're at your desk. You get up and you start walking toward the deck. You're still in the house. As you're taking that walk, what did you see?
Just my living room.
Okay, and who did you see?
I saw no one. I was home alone.
And what could you hear at that point? Or
Nothing.
did you hear?
Nothing.
Okay. And what happened next?
I walked out onto my deck where my plants are to water them.
Okay. As you were watering your plants, walking over to your plants, what did you see?
Just my backyard and my plants, but nothing unusual.
Whom might you have seen at that point?
I saw no one.
What did you hear?
From that location, you can hear a little bit of road noise. So I did hear some cars going by, but that's not unusual. So just, normal sounds that you hear outside.
Can you see Ms. Everhart? We know the package was. Could you see or hear the sequencing, folks? Could you feel the sequencing? What'd you see? Who'd you see? What'd you hear? Anybody have any questions about that? Or put differently, does that illustrate what we've been talking about as an application? Okay, let me stop the share, go back to the other screen. If we had a different format, if I were able to do this a little differently, and we teach this online, we actually break people into groups and have them do this, but you would have more material in your hands and so forth. You would simply continue that line of questioning through the period of time that represented the circle around the time-space intersection, so that when someone was far enough away in time or space from the event, I mean, you wouldn't do this all day for her. It happened around 9 o'clock on her front porch. So when you get to the point at maybe 9:15, perhaps it's over, maybe even earlier than that. But the point, I guess, is you go through it systematically the same way all the time. Now, so far, I've made it simple. It's what did you see, who did you see, what year? I was getting nothing, nobody, or nothing, and that makes it simple. Obviously, what you're looking for is detail. And there are going to be some standard follow-up questions we're going to want to ask when we start getting answers with content in them beyond nothing or nobody or whatever. So let's suppose we say, who did you see? We ask the question, person says, Frank Smith. You need to have a standard set of responses, questions to that. Who is Frank? Even if they've given the whole, who is he? Get some information about him that they can share. Where was Frank? One of the things that's going to be important in any investigation is where people were. Line of sight can be important, how close they were to somebody, whether they could hear. Where was Frank? And by the way, we don't know in advance if this is going to be important. We just have to collect it. That's part of the system. It's the thoroughness. What was Frank doing? That's critical, because what was Frank paying attention to? I've done exercises in front of people, created incidents in front of people. And I've had people who I gave a job to, and they were paying attention to the job, even though something was happening in front of them, never saw what happened in front of them. Because we want to know what Frank was doing at the time. And then we want to know, what else do you remember about Frank? What else would you remember? Now, this is interesting, by the way. Let's suppose the question was, who did you see? And the answer was, I saw a woman. I don't know who she was. I've never seen her before. So who is Frank, or who is the woman? We probably is irrelevant at that point. They've already answered. They don't know. Where was the woman? We're still going to ask about where she would be on that, any kind of diagram you might make. What was she doing? By the way, what she was doing might help identify her. We all were, by the way, I had an hour-long talk with a colleague just before I came on here, and she was apologizing to me because she was behaving like a bureaucrat. That's her job. And all about the rules and everything we have to pay attention to here at Penn State. And I'm thinking, here at Penn State, if you were delivering mail in a particular building in a particular floor at a particular time, somewhere in this bureaucracy, there's a record that would tell us who you are. So if he says there was a woman, she was delivering mail, that could be the identifier. So that's a piece of information. Okay. What else do you remember about the woman? I would ask that about Frank also, but what else do you remember? Now think about this. This is something I've always remembered from living in Watertown. Back in the days, before videotapes, now today's, if you go to a grocery store, any place you go, there's gonna be a tape of you. And so when somebody walks in, pulls out a gun, there's a video of that. In any case, I remember one time, this is probably back 1960, I was listening to the morning news on the radio. People used to listen to the radio for the news every morning in Water, WATN. And one of the 7-Eleven got robbed that night. And evidently they got the description from the store owner of the robber. And it went something like this. He was 35 years old, weighed between 160 and 165 pounds, and was wearing either a green or a brown jacket. Your job as a citizen, I guess, was to go out and find this 35-year-old man, 100 to 165 pounds, in a green or a brown jacket. And when I started teaching these classes, I started asking myself, how important is that information? Think about this. How do you know how old somebody is? Again, when I've done programs, particularly in person, over the years, I've been doing these programs for 40 years. I remember when I first started, by the way, I was prematurely gray. I admitted 32. My wife points out that it's gotten much grayer since we got married. It will be 41 years this year. And this weekend, too. I forgot I didn't get her a gift. Son of a gun, I better do something about that. All right, so in any case, I was in class one, and what I used to do in this class is I wouldn't say anything about my age or my weight. And at the end of the class, we're tying up, having the last piece of this event that we stage and so on. We have a conversation about it. And we ask for a description of a person who came in the room. But one of the things I do in kind of talking about the value of that, I say, okay, you guys have seen me for 3 days. How old am I? Simple question. All they've done is seen me, heard me talk. How old am I? Invariably, and honest to goodness, I could get hundreds of people come in and confirm this. invariably, at the time I was 33, I asked that question, it would be between 35 and somewhat higher, almost never lower. And one time, one day, a young woman, I was maybe 30, maybe 35. She said I was 62. 62. And I said, how is it that you think I'm 62? She still didn't know my age. She said, you remind me of my father. Now think about what's really happening here. She's hearing me speak. She sees my little bit of gray. And she's equating me to her father. She's kind of guessing. She's not described. Nobody's seen age. Nobody sees age walking around. What you see is hair color. You see wrinkles in the face or not. You see other bodily characteristics. You may judge the person based on what they talk about or how you're guessing it. Or as a friend of mine, you say guesstimate. It's a guesstimate. Weight. I always would ask about weight. And you know what? That's the same period of time. My weight would be anywhere. One time, one class, maybe I was 35 or 38. One class, I was either 145 pounds or 230 pounds. The same group of people looking at me at the same time for 3 days. So the question is, when you ask people this catalog, here's a little answer, how old, what did they say? Green or brown jacket? We've done this and we've had people who, I can't tell you what clothes they put on folks who've come in the room. They have nothing to do with what they actually worn, because they end up putting the clothes on a person who came in the room just a minute before or a minute after. So asking this list of questions, again, isn't very convincing. So what question do we ask? What else do you remember about this person? Let the person, the witness, tell you what they remember, not what you think they should remember. What were they paying attention to? And so, for example, if you said to me, what do you remember about this guy? And I said to you, he was wearing an earring. You might say to me, why would you remember that? And I'd say, you know what? I grew up in Watertown. I never saw a guy with an earring except Mr. Clean till I went to college. And ever since then, I've always wondered why guys wear earrings. I said, yeah, my daughter started dating guys and they were all wearing earrings. I can tell you whether a guy's wearing an earring from 3 miles, from 2 miles. I can tell you whether it's silver or gold. And from 1 mile, I can tell you what the inscription is. If I say he's wearing an earring, he's wearing an earring. You want something they have a reason to remember. Is that clear, folks? So it's just another way of tapping into that memory. And then you get to, who else did you see? No one. Where are we going then to what did you hear in that slice of time? By the way, there's almost an exception to every rule here. And so I just will share this with you. One time I was doing a training program at a hotel in Orangeburg, New York. I'll never forget, it's a Holiday Inn. It's still there. And I think it's still a Holiday Inn. In any case, couldn't find somebody to do this incident that we do, where we actually ask people to interview each other, take statements. And there was this one young lady at the desk. And I said to her, look, I'm desperate. I need someone to come in this room and do something and engage in this. And she's going to throw something at me. And it was this plate, it was a plate of toast. You can't hurt anybody with toast. So I gave her a plate of toast. And she said she would do it. So she comes in the room and she's not in the room more than 15 or 20 seconds, throws a plate of toast, she leaves. So I hear somebody interviewing a guy who, and I overhear, they ask the witness, the interviewer asks, about to describe the woman. He describes her hair and the hairstyle and the hair color correctly. He describes her makeup correctly. He describes the type and color of the clothing correctly, including the color of the stockings she was wearing and the style of shoes. And he got it all right. And I'm telling you, that is extraordinarily unusual, extraordinarily unusual. So I said to him during our discussion, I said, how is it you can be so certain about that? He said, I saw her come in the room. I'm going to be here another night. I thought I'd ask her out. Now, here's somebody who had a reason to know all that. Pay attention to that. So the next question, what can you tell me about this incident? He said, what incident? I didn't see any incident. He was so focused on her appearance, he didn't see her throw the plate of toast. So you can see, remember we said at the beginning, it's hard to know. It is hard to know. And it's complicated as an investigator to find out. However, if we slice the bologna, we have the best chance of getting as much information as we can, at least from the interview process. And one of the things we have going for us these days is technology. And the use of technology, whether it's video cameras all over the place, digital technology, people are always showing up with films of stuff on their cameras that, I mean, think about the people who would not have been convicted in the past few years without someone pulling out an iPhone or something of that sort. The reality here is that there are many other ways to help understand what happened and why. But conducting an interview is one of the most important and continues and will continue to be one of the most important ways to make that occur. I'm going to stop at this point. Mita, do you have anybody you see who has questions, or anybody have a question or any comments or anything I didn't explain well? I'd be glad to answer, please.
I don't have any questions in the chat.
No questions in the chat, anybody? I can't believe you believe everything I say, folks. And I only say that because I have two granddaughters live across the street and they don't believe anything I say. And they're teenagers, of course. So anything at all?
Professor, this is Don Collins. I'm a lawyer, and when I first started practicing, no one told me how to do depositions or anything like that.
Yeah.
And in my first deposition, on my way out the door, one of the senior attorneys said, well, you just ask him what happened. And then you say, what happened next? Then what happened after that? So that's a framework that works very well. So I appreciated that.
Yeah,
The other part,
I'm sorry?
I was going to say, the other part I'm always interested in is, I'm interested in, what the witness has to say, but I also want to know who else was there. What did this other person say?
Sure.
I mean, I want to know what the side of the collateral witnesses had to say according to this main witness as well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. That's why, Don, in every case we ask, what did you hear? Because if they were in a room and they heard something and they're working with you and they're wanting to help you, then that will come up. And then at some point, if you have a particular, let's suppose whether someone said X is critical to this case, and your witness never in fact mentions it. This gets to the question of asking leading questions. When I get to the end of slicing the bologna, there's one case where I might ask, I might say, at any point did you hear anyone say X?
right. Okay.
I might not tell you, but that may prompt memory too. But yeah, I understand exactly what you're looking for. You're looking for more information. Sometimes it's other witnesses and what they said to corroborate what they said and so on. Absolutely. Good point.
Thank
And
you.
you're not just saying that because you're a Penn Stater. I mean, you're saying,
I know.
go ahead. You started to say something else.
No, I just said thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Anybody else? Anything else?
Yeah, I was wondering if you're doing an interview by phone, for example, instead of in person, or if you're recording the interview or not recording, does any of that change your approach?
Well, first of all, it's interesting, Jeff. If it doesn't change my approach in terms of how I would ask questions. If I'm on a phone, I don't have nearly the amount of feedback I'd get if I were looking even in Zoom. Because, for example, we haven't gotten into some of the nuances. What if somebody looks uncomfortable? How are you going to respond to that during the interview and so on? You don't get that on the phone. You might get crying on the phone. Sometimes you may get hesitation or you may get anger, but you can't see the nonverbal activity that's going on. One of the things I would say is that I would probably always these days now trying to set something on Zoom or Teams or some other digital format, rather if we're going to do, and you're going to have to do stuff. In some cases, it makes more sense to do it, I think, in a digital way, particularly when you start thinking about having the time it takes to get to places, to get to witnesses, and so on. It wouldn't, if we were doing this on Zoom, it would not affect how I would ask questions at all. And in fact, the video that I showed you was done on Zoom. It wouldn't affect it. It does affect a couple things. Obviously, if somebody just turned their Zoom off, they just turned it off. And it's a, that, so you have a little less control over the environment. The issue of recording, this gets to another issue of how do we preserve. Remember, we talked about documentary evidence. Documentary evidence is the way we preserve testimonial evidence. I could turn the record functions on in Zoom. The problem is this is that I think particularly for older folks like myself, we grew up in a world where recording something was a death sentence if you said the wrong word. Richard Nixon lost the presidency because of some recordings, and most of us remember those days. Sometimes recordings chill people's willingness to just speak and to respond comfortably. Now, the reality is, I think, Jeff, nowadays, it is less uncomfortable for younger people, given the fact that everybody is recording everybody. They put the strangest things. I have never been on TikTok, but I understand. Is that, did I get TikTok right? Is that the right one? Some of you may know what I'm talking about. I just have heard about it. I've never looked at it, but evidently people are dying to perform on TikTok. So I'm thinking there are a whole group of people now who probably are less uncomfortable in this. Now, the problem with recording it, though, is then when you want to use it, it's going to be difficult because you're going to have to go back and try to find everything. You'd rather almost always have a transcript in front of you. It's easier to use. I remember the days when we used to record using the audio tapes. You'd have to send them away to be transcribed. So if we were doing a full-blown program, I would give you some options about taking notes, whether it's on Zoom or any other digital format, rather than recording. But recording can be important. I'm not suggesting it isn't and can't be used. I'm just saying it creates some complications. I hope that answers your question, Jeff. And if it doesn't, say so. Let me.
No, thank you. Thanks.
Welcome. Okay. Anyone else?
Antone, how does this questioning differ from that of examination of witnesses at an arbitration hearing?
At an arbitration, well, it differs in this respect. If you're the attorney for the employer, for example, you never want to ask a question to which you don't know the answer. I don't think I'm done. For any of the attorneys in the room, you're never going to ask if you don't, because you're at the mercy of what might come out of the person's mouth. Remember when I talked about asking questions here, you don't have to know the answer when you're slicing the bone. As a matter of fact, probably you don't know the answer. It's okay. One person said to me early on, we started using this technique, teaching this technique. One of the beauties for the investigator, it puts so little pressure on them other than to ask questions in sequence in the right format. Because otherwise you have to be always thinking you know the answer, you know what's going to come out of someone's mouth. You don't need to know it. But when you're doing examination at a hearing, you better know what's going to come out of someone's mouth, because you're not going to want to ask a question that would harm, for which an answer might occur you're not going to be aware of. It would harm your case. Your desire there is to represent your client. I have a video I could show you. I'm not going to take a chance on getting it all screwed up here, but I'll describe it to you. One of the ways in which I've explained the difference between direct and circumstantial evidence, we didn't get into that today, but if I were in a regular class, would be a case that involved, it had to do with a barroom fight. It was an illustration. I can't even tell you that I remember where I learned this from, but I think it was when my ex-wife was in law school and I was in graduate school, and someone was telling this story about what happened in the criminal law, or maybe it was procedure class. And so the story goes something like this: a barroom fight. And evidently in the barroom fight, a guy's ear is bitten off. Somebody bites the guy's ear off. And so at the hearing, there's a witness. And on cross-examination, this goes to the other side of we're in cross-examination now. The witness is asked, did you actually see my client bite the ear of the witness off? And the answer was no. Now, one of the things we know is that probably that's as good as it's going to get for the attorney for his side. He asked the next question. Evidently, he didn't know what the answer was going to be. And he said, well, how can you be so certain that the guy bit the ear off? He said, I saw him spit it out. Now, I got it, by the way, in terms of direct and circuit, it may not be direct evidence is how did the ear remove from the head, but boy, it's great evidence. I mean, how many times do you spit an ear out and for what purposes? But the reality here, it's one of those questions you never should have asked. So in the case of slicing the bologna, you're going to ask a question because you don't care what the person's going to say. When you're in direct or cross-examination in hearing, you absolutely have to care because it could affect the outcome of your case, your side. Amita, does that help?
It sounds like the cognitive interview is great for information gathering, pre-arbitration hearing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the information gathered is going to help the advocate prepare for the arbitration examination.
Yeah, and it's going to help the other side prepare also. It's going to help anybody prepare. But let me say one other thing, because this gets to the heart of what I care about more than the arbitration. Maybe most people here are worried about arbitration. I care more about making evidence-based decisions as a manager. I want managers who are deciding whether somebody's guilty or not guilty of something to make decisions based on properly collected information. It's done in a speedy, thorough, and objective fashion. Because the more important question to me is not whether we win or lose an arbitration, it's whether we should have fired somebody or not fired somebody, or offered this settlement or not offered. That's the more important question, is treating people honestly and fairly. I will tell you, I've spent most of my life working on the management aisle, even though I've had experience as a labor person, I've experience as an arbitrator, but I've worked most of my life with managers. And very frankly, I've seen obscene things happen in terms of decisions people make about what they're going to do. Sometimes they'll say, well, we'll fire him, let an arbitrator put him back to work. Well, that's just not nice. I'm sorry. At some point, you have to have a reason to fire somebody if you're going to do it. It ought to be a compelling and not in the sense of a criminal trial, but something that you're not doing simply because it's simple and people won't yell at you. Because very frankly, sometimes managers, and I've seen this in human service organizations, are so afraid of advocacy groups in the community, they fire somebody just so they can say, we fired that. See how tough we are on this person. So at some point, from my point of view, the information gathering piece is important to managers, because then they'll have the better idea of what the conclusion of fact is, what happened and why, and then can make a better decision about what path they're going to take in deciding how to handle the accusation an employee makes of it. I mean, maybe that was a little too much, maybe polemic, but I do think that's important. Anyone else? Patricia, you uncovered yourself there. Did you want to say something, Patricia? No? Okay, very good. Nice. That's all right. All right. See, as soon as you show your face, you're stuck here. I can use it. Anyone else? Any other questions? Anything? Go ahead, Kelly.
I just wanted to thank you for that last example. It's a key reason of why I signed up for this today. A person that I management tends to ask questions that are very leading. There's the list, proper, speedy, honest, and fair. Feel like we're having some problems meeting those standards. And I'm just looking for ways to offset that. And so I very much appreciate the example you just gave. It's exactly what I'm going through right now and wanting not to be repeated with other people. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. By the way, if anybody has any other questions at any point, just Mita, you can share my email address with folks.
Okay.
I'd be glad if you have a question to send it on. I'd be glad to respond. Give you any other information. I tell you what, we're near closing time here. Anything else? Anybody?
No.
Mita, what I'll do is send you the slide deck before I'm on my way to Watertown as soon as I get done here. So I'll send this to you immediately. And I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this.
No, Antone, I want to thank you, first of all, for teaching us how to slice that bologna in space and in time, right?
Okay.
And then secondly, I hope hopefully you'll have an enjoyable anniversary since it only comes
Thank
once
you.
a year.
I'm hoping we get snowed in, but my wife, I'm not sure is that excited about it. You guys take care. Have a great day. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome,
you.
guys. Take care. Bye-bye.